Edwards, according to a report by the Mercatus Center that I just cited, 90% of the Section 1705 loans went to subsidize lower-risk power plants backed by big companies which actually had pretty good access to capital. These companies included Goldman Sachs, NextEra Energy, and General Electric. If these projects would have been built without government guarantees, why do you think that DOE would be wanting to subsidize them, and do you think this is just yet another form of corporate welfare?
It does seem to me that you can divide the Section 1703 and 1705 projects into two sort of pots. The great majority of them were subsidies for projects, in my view, would have gone ahead anyway because, as I said, 29 states now have these renewable purchasing requirements, mandates that are escalating and increasing over time. These projects were going to get built, and when federal subsidies were layered in, it just meant that the investors like Warren Buffett and others earned higher returns than otherwise. And then there was a smaller group of other investments into very risky projects like Solyndra and a few others that didn't pan out, and you know, those didn't have those sort of state subsidy backing. So I think in both cases federal intervention doesn't make sense. I think the state governments subsidize renewables so much now, not only with the purchase requirements, with the tax credits, their own subsidies. Federal subsidies are overkill, and I have in my testimony some discussion from the New York Times which looked at this and agreed that during the Obama years there really was overkill in subsidies.
Thank you. I want to follow up with you, Dr. Yonk, and I'm going to come back to something you said in your written testimony. The follow-up is that with all of these large companies applying for loan guarantees, what does that mean for the little guy, number one? What about a small business, a startup, or one innovative entrepreneur? Do they have the resources to compete against the lobbying power of these big companies? What has been your findings?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think you illustrate one of the problems with any sort of approach in this regard, and that is that precisely those that entrepreneur in the garage with the crazy idea will never have access to these sorts of loan guarantees. What's interesting is, as Mr. Reicher said, these are really about commercialization of projects moving from one phase to another, as opposed to actually spurring the innovation of new technology industries. And so it limits greatly the ability of those to do it, and we select on those that are already at a certain point, and we make a continued bet on that same industry over time.
Thank you. You had made the comment that you can't measure what has not happened, and I was following you in your testimony, and I had actually written down what cannot be measured is if the private equity firms adopt a wait and see posture. They're standing on the sidelines, and you'll never know what they contemplated not doing, if that's not too many negatives, you know. And so I think you make a good point. So what does that mean, Dr. Yonk, for innovation in the energy market in practical terms? Don't DOE loans, guarantees to some companies discourage investment in others? Do you know of examples?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. There are two sort of, let me take the first question and then apply it to the second. And that is, what I believe happens in these regards is, as individuals are making these private risk calculations, as hedge funds or wherever are, they now incorporate the probability of a loan guarantee being brought into it, and they seek to mitigate risk on their own side by following the loan guarantee or the issuance of a loan by government. And as a result, we end up primarily betting on, because this again is a commercialization issue, we end up betting on technologies that are attempting to make the transition into full-scale commercial size as opposed to spurring the innovation at the smaller scale. And so what I believe happens, and this is where the counterfactual comes in, is that we end up seeing that there is a flight towards pre-existing alternatives as opposed to what might be termed the crazier ideas that in large part, if you read the background on these loan guarantees, it was meant to do risky things. So we talk a lot about the risk profile. I hear the risk profile of this, if it was meant to fund risky technologies of a 2% loss rate, that's not encouraging to me if the goal was in fact to be spurring the riskier side of innovation.
Thank you. I've got about a minute left. Actually, I'm down to 11 seconds. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes, Mr. Vesey.